Somewhere on a factory floor, a single forged gear comes off the press. One of them is fitted into a spinning reel that sells for $50. The next one off that same press, same alloy, same cold forging, same tolerances, is fitted into a reel that sells for $800. Now, the $800 reel is the better reel. That part is honest, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But the distance between those two reels is not where you've been told it is. And almost everything you've been told about that distance was shaped by people with a quiet financial reason to keep you from looking too closely at the gear itself. By the time we reach number 3 on this list, you're going to watch a $50 reel share its gear forging with a flagship, and you're going to understand precisely what that $750 gap actually buys you. It is not the part that fights the fish. These are 12 cheap spinning reels, every one of them under $100, that tournament-level anglers actually rely on, and that the people paid to talk about gear will never put on camera. Not because there's a conspiracy with a name and a meeting, because of something simpler and much harder to argue with. I've spent enough time around how this tackle gets built and priced to tell you where the money really goes. And here's the thing, nobody selling you a reel has any reason to say out loud. You cannot patent the words good enough. You cannot package good enough in a fresh blister pack and sell it back to the same angler every spring. There is no peg on the tackle wall for a reel that already does the job. So the market does the only thing a market knows how to do. It points your attention at the reel it can sell you again next year. Now layer the sponsorship system on top of that. Every pro you watch lift a trophy and praise a reel is under a contract that spells out exactly which brand names are allowed to leave their mouth on camera. A sponsored angler physically cannot tell you the cheap reel is enough. That isn't a theory. That is what the contract is for. But nothing in that contract follows him to the back of the boat, where the reel he actually grabs when the camera shuts off tells a very different story. That gap, between what they're allowed to say and what they quietly tie on, is the entire reason you were never handed this list. Before the countdown, one piece of mechanical reality, because it explains everything that follows. Picture a diving board at a pool. It's bolted down at one end, the far end hangs free, and when you stand on the tip, the whole thing bends. Now picture a clothesline pulled tight between two posts, held at both ends. Lean on the middle and it barely moves. A bait casting reel is the clothesline. The spool sits supported on both sides. A spinning reel is the diving board. The spool hangs off a single shaft, and under a hard load the whole frame wants to flex right at the base. Engineers call that a cantilever, held at one end, loaded at the other. An $800 reel fights that flex with exotic, feather-light metals. A $75 reel fights it with high-grade aluminum and dense carbon composite, and gives up, at most, an ounce or so. You are paying hundreds of dollars to remove about 1 ounce. That's the trade. It's worth it to some anglers, but know that that is the trade. And here's the part the marketing buries. The bite you feel travels up the rod blank, not the reel. The reel is just a winch. The sensitivity lives in your rod's graphite, not in the thing that stores your line. There is exactly one place where the money buys you real, measurable engineering. And we'll get to it at number 1, because it's also the reason a $90 reel takes the top spot. Hold that thought. Number 12, the Cast King Centron, and its slightly upgraded sibling, the Megatron. Before you scroll past a budget name, sit with the logic. Cast King competes by refusing to charge you for prestige. No flagship halo, no tournament stage theater, just the parts. The Centron runs around $30, with a manufacturer-rated carbon drag listed near 17 pounds of stopping power. For ultralight freshwater work, a Ned rig for spotted bass, a drop shot for crappie, a tiny jig for bluegill, that is a real tool, not a toy. 3 Centrons cost what one mid-tier name-brand reel costs, and on a morning chasing panfish, the functional difference between them is, honestly, nothing. The only real question is whether you needed the other $200 of badge. Quick one for the comments while you sit with that. Are you a finesse angler or a power angler? Light line and subtle baits, or heavy cover and hard hook sets? Hold your answer, because it decides which of these next reels is actually built for you. Number 11, the Daiwa Crossfire LT. Spin the handle of one of these for the first time and watch your own face, because anglers do the same double take every time. A $35 reel has no business feeling this composed. Reviewers at outfits like Wired to Fish have documented that reaction over and over. The reason isn't magic. Daiwa runs what's best described as trickle-down engineering. The mechanism from their $700 reels gets preserved on the way down the line, while the premium materials get quietly stripped away. The Crossfire borrows its retrieved geometry straight from that lineage. For dock fishing, pier panfish, and Midwest walleye on a budget, it performs shoulder-to-shoulder with reels 3 times its price. What you gave up was the body material. What you kept was the feel. Number 10. The Okuma Samar. It earns its place for a reason bigger than the reel itself. It shows you how good gear stays invisible. Around $45, it carries corrosion-resistant bearings and a machined aluminum spool, the kind of hardware you'd normally only meet in the 100 to 150 bracket. So why have you barely heard of it? Not because anyone is corruptly burying it, because attention in this industry follows advertising budgets, and Okuma spends a fraction of what the giants spend to put a name in front of you. That isn't a scandal. It's just how a market allocates your attention toward whoever paid the most to rent it. And the quiet result is that a genuinely good, genuinely cheap reel sits on the shelf almost unmentioned. The economics decided that for you, long before you ever walked into the shop. Number 9. The Piscifun Viper X. The angle here is the supply chain itself. Most reels reach you only after passing through a chain of distributors, and every hand in that chain adds its own margin, none of which makes the reel turn any smoother. Piscifun sells direct to you and skips that whole layer. At around $45, you get a carbon drag rated past 20 pounds, an aluminum body, and an anti-reverse system that kills the little bit of backplay most budget handles have. Independent teardowns keep finding the insides more sophisticated than the sticker suggests. Kayak anglers reach for these on purpose, because when you're paddling to the next spot, every gram you're not carrying is a gram working in your favor. You're paying for the reel, not for the trip it took to find you. Number 8. The 13 Fishing Axiom. Most anglers think sealed bearings are a saltwater concern, but freshwater is quietly brutal too. Rain, lake grit, the fine sand that rides in on your line and grinds a bearing down to a whisper by the middle of summer. The Axiom, around $80, seals the parts that usually die first. A sealed line roller, sealed bearings, a rotor closed off to the world. The payoff isn't glamour. It's a reel that still feels new in its 3rd season, while the open bearing reel beside it sounds like a coffee grinder. Durability is a performance feature. It just never photographs well enough to put in an ad. Number 7. The Shimano Katana FE. To understand it, you need one fact about the company. Shimano started in 1921 making bicycle components, and that origin still runs through everything they build. Internally, the rule is unbending. Even the cheapest reel in the catalog has to feel like a Shimano. And that single mandate accidentally drags their budget reels up past competitors at the same price. The Katana, somewhere around $50, uses the same oscillation system, the mechanism that lays your line evenly across the spool, that you'll find in reels costing far more. 4+1 bearings, a graphite body. Shimano cut cost where you won't feel it, and protected what you will. As a dedicated ultralight setup for trout and panfish, the reel you can bounce off a rock without grieving over it. It's genuine Shimano engineering at gas station pricing. Number 6. The Luz Speed Spin CRX. Here's the idea that matters. Spin a solid metal disc, then spin a wire-spoke bicycle wheel the same size, and the wheel comes up to speed faster, because there's less mass way out at the edge that has to get moving. Luz cut their rotor down to a skeletal carbon frame for that exact reason. Less rotational inertia, so the reel starts and stops faster under your hand. When a smallmouth grabs your bait and swims straight back at the boat, you have a half-second to gather the slack and drive the hook home. A reel that picks up line instantly is the difference between a hook set and a story about the one that got away. It also runs a braid-ready spool, so you can skip the monofilament backing. Pure efficiency, nothing wasted. Number 5. The Daiwa Regal LT, and this one starts with a patent you can pull up yourself. Daiwa's Air Rotor, a hollow rotor design that strips weight off the part that actually spins, is patented technology, documented in the United States Patent Office. It was engineered for the Exist, a reel that lives somewhere between $700 and $900. And within a few years, that very same patented rotor had quietly worked its way down into the Regal, a reel you can buy for around 50. A patented flagship rotor, dropped into a budget frame. For finesse fishing, where a lighter setup means you feel more and tire less across a long day on the water, that weight savings is a real edge, not a spec sheet brag. The patent didn't get any cheaper to manufacture. They simply stopped charging you for the name on the side. Number 4. The Pfluger President, a reel that carries both a proud story and a quietly uncomfortable one. Pfluger's roots run back to the 1800s in Akron, Ohio, and the President has been in continuous production since the 1930s, one of the longest unbroken runs in all of American tackle. That's the proud part. Here's the uncomfortable part, and it's a matter of public record. Pfluger, Abu Garcia, Penn, and Shakespeare, 4 names you watch compete for your money on the very same store shelf, are all owned by a single company called Pure Fishing. And Pure Fishing itself is owned by a private equity firm, Sycamore Partners. So the fierce rivalry you imagine between those budget brands is, in part, theater. They aren't enemies, they're siblings, dressed up to look like a choice. Once you can see the corporate family tree, the shelf stops looking like a competition and starts looking like a menu written by one kitchen. The President itself, though, is the real thing. 10+1 bearings, an aluminum body and spool, a sealed drag stacking Teflon and stainless discs that independent teardowns confirm runs smooth and consistent. 140 years of reel making distilled down into something you can actually afford. And the next reel is the one this entire video was built around, the $50 reel that shares its gear forging with an $800 flagship. Number 3. The Shimano Sedona FJ, the reel this whole list was built to put in front of you. It sells for around $50. And at its core sits Hagane gear, Shimano's cold-forged drive gear. Now, cold forging matters, so here's what it actually means. Most budget gears are cast, molten metal poured into a mold, which leaves the grain of the metal loose and a little imprecise. Cold forging instead presses the gear into shape under enormous force, packing the metal grain tight and shaping a denser, more exact tooth. And that is the same forging method Shimano uses on the gears inside their flagship reels, the $800 machines. The same method, in a $50 reel. Now let me be precise, because this is exactly where lesser videos start lying to you. The Sedona does not contain the entire flagship gear system. What the $800 reels add on top of that forged gear is refinement. Finer micro-cut tooth geometry, the load spread more evenly across each tooth, materials shaved lighter. That refinement is real, and a tournament caster grinding 12-hour days will feel it. But strip a reel down to what actually fights a fish, and the foundation, that dense, cold-forged gear, is shared. So when people say a $50 Sedona humiliates an $800 reel, here is the honest version. For the fish on the end of your line, the forged gear is the forged gear. That $750 gap buys you a smoothness most anglers will never feel in the middle of a fight. Look at the reviews and you'll see the same phrase over and over. Feels like my $200 reel. They aren't wrong. They're feeling the forging. So why would Shimano build the single strongest argument against spending $800 and then stamp their own name right on it? Because the 14-year-old whose first real reel is a Sedona becomes a Shimano angler for the rest of his life. They aren't losing that sale. They're planting it. The cheapest reel in the case is a 30-year customer in disguise. Everything we're covering here, the full 12, what each reel shares with the expensive tier, the one place the money actually buys reel engineering, and the sources so you can check every word of it yourself, is gathered onto a single page, built to live taped inside your tackle box lid. Point your phone at the code on screen and it's yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me, because the last 2 reels are where the budget secret stops being clever and becomes the thing working guides quietly bet their income on. Before number 2 and number 1, run the arithmetic the industry would rather you skipped. Say you buy several Sedona-class reels for what one premium reel costs. Now you've got a dedicated reel and rod for every technique. Finesse, topwater, a jig, a crankbait, a drop shot, each one rigged and ready in the rod locker. The angler beside you with a single expensive reel is doing something else entirely during the bite. He's cutting line and re-rigging, burning the exact 10 or 15 minutes when the fish finally turned on. Multiply that across a season, and across the years, and the cheaper path doesn't just match the expensive one. It quietly pays for your tournament entries, or a decade of fishing licenses, with money that would otherwise be sitting unused inside one beautiful reel. The right reel was never the most expensive one. It's the one that leaves cash in your pocket to actually go fishing. Number 2. The Daiwa Fuego LT. This one reveals a deliberate line drawn in a boardroom. The Fuego is the cheapest reel Daiwa will sell you, with a Zion body, their carbon composite that's nearly as rigid as aluminum, at noticeably less weight. That's documented materials science, not a slogan. And here's the tell. Daiwa draws the Zion line right here on purpose. Go any cheaper, and a Zion reel would start eating into their own $150 and $200 models. So everything below the Fuego is kept in ordinary graphite, not because the cheaper reel couldn't have carried it, but to protect the price of the reel sitting just above it. For a freshwater angler chasing bigger bass and walleye, where you want rigidity and a tough drag without hauling extra weight around all day, the Fuego is genuine arbitrage hiding in plain sight. Flagship material, at the very bottom of the lineup, because that is exactly as far down as they dared let it fall. And number 1. The Daiwa BG. Remember the one place I told you the money buys real engineering? This is it. The BG has a fully machined aluminum body, not graphite, not composite, machined metal, the same construction you meet in reels priced 3 to 5 times higher. And here's why that isn't a spec sheet flex. Under a heavy drag load, a big catfish digging for the bottom, a muskie surging, a heavy base buried deep in cover, a graphite body flexes, just slightly, and that flex throws your gear teeth a hair out of alignment at the exact moment you need them locked. That's verifiable physics. The machined aluminum body doesn't give, it holds its mesh under load, and it pairs that with Daiwa's flagship-grade tournament drag. And when it finally wears out, you don't throw it away. Daiwa sells the parts, and any decent shop can rebuild it for years. That is why anglers whose paycheck depends on landing fish, the ones who can't afford a reel that folds at the worst possible second, quietly run a $90 reel as their primary. Not their backup, their primary. The price tag is the only cheap thing about it. Go back to that factory floor from the start. The single forged gear, headed for 2 reels, $750 apart. Nothing about that gear changed in the last 20 minutes. What changed is that you can now see exactly what that gap is made of. A little of it is real engineering, the body that won't flex, the materials shaved lighter. Most of it is refinement you may fish your entire life and never once feel. And almost none of it is the part that actually hooks and holds a fish. None of this was ever hidden in a vault. It was just never worth anyone's money to say out loud, because good enough can't be patented, can't be resold every spring, and can't be hung on a peg at a price that protects the reel beside it. And the mechanics are not opinion. A well-placed bearing beats a poorly placed one no matter how high the bearing count climbs. Sensitivity is the rod, not the reel. And aluminum holds its line under load while graphite gives. That's physics. And physics doesn't care what the sticker says. If you'd rather fish knowing what the tackle wall has no reason to tell you, you already know which side of this you're on. Subscribe, and we'll keep pulling the rest of it back into the light. One reel, one quiet piece of the truth at a time.